Dust swirled along the prairie, catching the last light of the sun and turning the air into a haze of gold and orange. Cole McGraw urged his horse forward, the rhythmic clop of hooves on hard-packed dirt echoing across the empty land. He had ridden long, hoping to leave behind the chaos of the neighboring towns, hoping to find a small settlement where the saloon didn't smell of desperation and whiskey, and the people didn't carry the kind of stories that weighed on a man's soul. But as he neared the outskirts of Red River, a gnawing unease settled in his chest, something beyond the usual caution of a man who had seen more gunfire than laughter. Windows were shuttered, doors bolted tight, and the faintest murmur of frightened voices drifted out from the shadows. Something was wrong. He slowed his horse, scanning the streets. The town was quiet, too quiet. And then he saw them. A group of rough men, faces twisted with cruelty, circling someone near the edge of town, their hands clenched around clubs and knives, eyes hungry for dominance. Cole's stomach turned as his gaze fell upon the figure they were surrounding, a woman, barefoot, her dress torn and stained with blood, yet moving with a ferocity that made his pulse quicken. She was small, wiry, but the way she swung a piece of broken wood at the nearest man, the way she sank her teeth into her own lip to bite back a scream, made it clear she was fighting for her life, not begging for mercy. Cole's instincts surged forward before thought could catch up. He spurred his horse into a gallop, dust flying in every direction, and reached for his revolver. The men hadn't noticed him yet, they were too focused on their prey. With steady hands honed from years on the trail and in gunfights, he fired, one shot, then another, sending two of them sprawling. The remaining men whirled in surprise, and Cole's horse reared as he fired again, scattering them into the shadows. Heart pounding, adrenaline burning, he leapt from the saddle and rushed toward her. The woman turned, eyes wide, but not with fear, more like a mixture of shock and defiance. Her hair was matted with sweat and blood, her lips cut and trembling, but there was a fire there that struck something deep in Cole's chest. He knelt beside her, offering a steadying hand. She flinched, almost pulling away, then, after a heartbeat, she grasped it, letting him help her to her feet. "You're hurt," he said, though the words felt inadequate in the face of her sheer will. "I'm fine," she rasped, though the shallow rise and fall of her chest betrayed the lie. They'll come back." Cole frowned, scanning the horizon. The sun was setting fast, painting the sky in streaks of blood orange and purple. He realized she was right, the attack had been deliberate, targeted. This wasn't some random act of violence, it was a vendetta, and the men would return with more force. He glanced at her again, noting the bruises on her arms, the scratches along her legs, and the bloodied tear along her cheek. And yet, despite everything, she stood tall, almost proud in her resistance. She wasn't a victim, she was a fighter. "I'm Cole," he said, trying to keep his tone calm, but something in her gaze made him realize that words were secondary to actions. "You need to come with me." She hesitated, then, with a cautious nod, allowed him to lead her toward his horse. She mounted slowly, wincing with every movement, and he swung himself up behind her, his arm protecting her without her asking. The ride out of town was tense and silent, save for the occasional shout in the distance, men searching, no doubt, but still far enough away to give them some breathing room. As the prairie stretched wide around them, Cole finally allowed himself to study her more closely. Her name was Lila, she told him between ragged breaths, and her story poured out in fragments, each one worse than the last. Her family had been raided by a gang claiming debts she had never owed, and they had vanished, leaving her to fend for herself. The thought made Cole's jaw tighten. He had wandered the West for years, keeping to himself, thinking he understood hardship, but this was a different kind of survival, one born of violence, fear, and unimaginable loss. Yet through it all, Lila's spirit remained unbroken. Even in blood and filth, she retained a sharpness in her gaze, a determination in her movements, a readiness to fight for every breath she had left. Cole felt an unfamiliar stirring in his chest. He had always thought he wanted a woman who was untouched, innocent, someone who fit neatly into the stories he told himself about life and love. But standing beside her now, he realized how empty that desire had been. Purity was a fantasy. Strength, courage, resilience, those were real, and Lila had them in abundance. Night fell thick and heavy as they reached a small, abandoned cabin miles from town. Cole dismounted, keeping his hand on his revolver, alert to every sound in the surrounding darkness. Lila followed, her bare feet silent but careful, each step measured and cautious. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and decay, but it was a sanctuary, however fragile. She sank to the floor, pressing her hands to her knees as she tried to staunch the bleeding, while Cole searched the place, making it secure. They spoke little at first, words unnecessary when every glance and movement carried meaning. Cole watched her carefully, noting the way her jaw clenched as she worked, the fire in her eyes, the subtle tremble that betrayed the exhaustion she refused to acknowledge. He wanted to say something comforting, but the right words were elusive. Instead, he simply stayed near, keeping watch, feeling a protective urge he had never known before. As the night deepened, they shared fragments of their lives. Lila spoke of her family, of dreams shattered by violence, of the fear that had become her constant companion. Cole, in turn, shared less, but when he did, it was raw and honest. A life of wandering, of survival over comfort, of a lonely pursuit of control in a world that refused to bend to his will. Yet through their stories, a connection began to form, not one born of fantasy, innocence, or expectation, but of recognition, understanding, and a shared hunger for life despite its brutality. Hours passed, and the prairie outside whispered with wind and distant animals. Every creak of the cabin, every shadow, heightened their senses. Sleep was impossible, but there was a strange comfort in proximity, in knowing they were not facing the night alone. Cole realized he was no longer thinking of the woman he had once imagined as an ideal partner. He was thinking of this woman, bloodied, barefoot, fearless, and alive, and the strange, unbidden desire to stand beside her in whatever storms might come. By dawn, the first light seeped through the cracks in the cabin walls. Cole's mind was awake, alert, but something inside had shifted. He no longer wanted innocence or perfection. What mattered was survival, courage, and the fire of a soul that refused to bow. And in Lila, he had found all of that, raw, untamed, and utterly compelling. The journey ahead would be dangerous, uncertain, and bloody, but for the first time in years, he felt ready. Not because he sought control, not because he sought a fairy tale, but because he had seen strength in its purest form and wanted, for the first time, to fight beside it. The first light of dawn filtered through the cracks in the cabin walls, casting long slivers of gold across the worn floorboards. Lila sat quietly, pressing torn cloth against a bruise on her arm, while Cole moved methodically around the room, securing the small space. Every step, every creak, carried the weight of unspoken fear, the knowledge that the men who had attacked her were still out there, and this temporary safety was fragile at best. Cole had ridden many trails and faced countless dangers, but there was something about this fight that gnawed at him. He wasn't just protecting land or property. He was protecting a life that had refused to be broken, and in doing so, he found himself more invested than he had ever thought possible. They ate a meager breakfast in silence. Cole had hunted a rabbit the night before, its fur still drying in the cold morning air, and he had managed to start a fire to roast it. Lila watched him with a strange intensity, as if studying not just his movements but the man he was beneath the dust, scars, and hard eyes. She had been taught to rely on herself and to trust no one, yet something about Cole, his calm, his focus, the way he had arrived seemingly out of nowhere and fought for her, made her reconsider that lesson. Perhaps trust didn't need to be absolute, perhaps it could be earned in moments of life and death. As the sun climbed higher, Cole stepped outside, scanning the prairie that stretched endlessly in every direction. The wind carried distant noises, the crack of a branch, the call of a hawk, but nothing that suggested the gang had returned yet. Still, he knew better than to relax. Men like that didn't give up. They came back, stronger, more vicious, each time. He glanced back at Lila, who had followed him out, barefoot and cautious, her dress still torn, her hair hanging in damp strands around her face. Despite her exhaustion, she moved with a careful precision, her eyes alert to every sound and shadow. She wasn't waiting for him to protect her. She was ready to fight. Over the next few days, the two settled into a rhythm, a tense partnership forged in necessity. They scavenged supplies from nearby abandoned cabins, reinforced the fragile walls of their own shelter, and shared long stretches of silence punctuated by whispered conversations. Lila told him more about her family, her small homestead, and the quiet life that had been ripped from her by greed and violence. Cole listened, sometimes offering a quiet word of comfort, sometimes simply sitting with her as she processed her trauma. The stories were heart-wrenching, but they revealed something else as well, a resilience that refused to be extinguished. At night, when the prairie grew dark and the wind moaned through the cracks in the cabin, Cole and Lila would talk about the future. Not a fantastical future, full of ease and comfort, but one of survival, freedom, and mutual protection. Lila admitted she had never trusted anyone completely before, and Cole confessed that he had wandered the West too long, seeking something he didn't understand, thinking that life was best lived alone. But in her presence, he realized the truth: connection mattered more than control, and courage mattered more than innocence. One evening, as twilight settled over the prairie, they heard the first unmistakable sounds of the gang returning: the creak of saddles, the distant bark of orders shouted over the wind. Cole's jaw tightened, and Lila's hands instinctively went to her knife. They exchanged a quick, meaningful glance, and the unspoken agreement hung heavy in the air. This time, there would be no running. This time, they would face the danger together. When the men arrived, it was chaos. They came in force, mounted on horses, brandishing weapons and shouting threats. But Cole and Lila were ready. Lila moved with a precision that belied her size, her knife cutting through the air, her strikes calculated and deadly. Cole fired his revolvers with unerring aim, picking off one man after another, while simultaneously keeping an eye on Lila to ensure she stayed safe. Each moment was a blur of adrenaline, fear, and raw instinct, yet despite the chaos, they moved as one. They were no longer just protector and protected, they were partners, a unit forged in fire, blood, and necessity. When the dust finally settled, only silence remained. The gang lay scattered across the prairie, some fleeing, some incapacitated, none daring to challenge them again. Cole's chest heaved as he lowered his guns, eyes immediately finding Lila. She stood, bloodied and exhausted, but unbowed. Her bare feet were caked in dirt and blood, her dress torn, yet there was an unmistakable light in her eyes, a defiance, a victory, a stubborn refusal to be broken. "You didn't need saving," Cole said quietly, almost reverently, "you needed someone to fight with you." Lila's lips curved into a faint, tired smile. "And I needed you to see me as I am," she replied. "Not what you wanted me to be." The words hung between them, heavy and powerful. Cole realized that every expectation he had held about women, love, and life had been shattered in these past few days. He hadn't wanted a virgin or a blank slate, he had wanted someone he could control, someone predictable. But Lila was anything but predictable. She was chaos and courage intertwined, beauty and scars wrapped in defiance. And in her presence, he finally understood what mattered most: not perfection, but strength; not innocence, but survival; not compliance, but fire. Over the following days, they prepared to leave the cabin and the prairie behind. They scavenged what supplies they could, tended to wounds, and shared quiet moments by the fire where the conversation turned to lighter things: memories of laughter, the simple pleasures of food cooked over a fire, the dream of a future where they could build something together. The bond between them grew stronger, not in grand gestures or declarations, but in mutual understanding, respect, and the shared experience of facing life's darkest moments together. As they rode out across the open prairie, the horizon stretched endlessly before them, a canvas of possibility. Cole felt a clarity he had never known. Life wasn't about the stories he had once chased. It wasn't about idealized women, perfect towns, or neatly wrapped endings. Life was raw, dangerous, beautiful, and fleeting. And it was best faced with someone who could meet you eye to eye, shoulder to shoulder, no matter the scars or the blood or the fear. Lila rode beside him, her bare feet tucked carefully against the horse's sides, her gaze fixed on the horizon. There was no fear now, only determination and a strange serenity born of survival and partnership. They had both been tested, beaten, and left on the edge of despair, yet here they were, together, stronger than they had been apart. Cole realized that this was the life he had been searching for: not safe, not controlled, not neat, but alive, real, and shared with someone who refused to bend. The sun rose higher, burning away the morning mist, and in its light, the prairie seemed to stretch endlessly, a symbol of freedom and possibility. Cole knew there would be challenges ahead, dangers yet unseen, and struggles that would test them again and again. But he also knew that he and Lila were ready. They had faced blood, fear, and violence together, and had emerged not broken, but bonded. As they rode side by side, leaving behind the remnants of the cabin and the chaos of the past, Cole understood something profound. True connection is not found in perfection, but in courage. True love is not found in innocence, but in resilience. And those who fight together, who survive together, are stronger than anything life can throw their way. Lila had shown him that, and in doing so, she had changed the course of his life forever. The prairie stretched on, endless and unbroken, a testament to the freedom they had earned, and the life they were about to build, not in fantasy, not in idealized dreams, but in reality, forged by fire, blood, and an unshakable bond. And in that moment, Cole knew he would never look at life the same way again. He didn't want a perfect story. He wanted Lila, with all her scars, all her fire, and all her unyielding strength. And with her, he was ready to face anything.